Ferrari's straight-line problem at Spa is real, it's documented, and it's now sitting inside a pile of telemetry the team can't fully explain. But is that actually what stunned them, or is something else going on beneath the data that nobody in the paddock wants to say out loud just yet? Start with what's confirmed, because the foundation here matters more than usual. Kimi Antonelli won the 2026 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps, his 6th victory of the season, converting Mercedes' 10th consecutive pole position into a race win that stretched his championship lead even further. Charles Leclerc finished second for Ferrari, just under 2 seconds behind, after a virtual safety car pit stop briefly handed him the race lead before Antonelli reclaimed it on lap 34 and held on. Lewis Hamilton came home fourth, but only after Ferrari was fined for an unsafe release that saw his car catch a mechanic in the pit lane during a double-stacked stop. The team avoided a sporting penalty for Hamilton himself, keeping his result intact, even as the incident triggered an FIA investigation. On paper, that reads like a strong weekend for the Scuderia. 2 cars in the top 4, a genuine podium threat until the final laps, a team principal publicly pleased with the outcome. So why is there a version of this story circulating where Ferrari's own data left them stunned rather than satisfied? Here's the tension, and it's worth sitting with it for a moment. Fred Vasseur, Ferrari's team principal, told F1 TV after the race that the team was not expecting this kind of result at either Silverstone or Spa, given how poorly the SF26's characteristics were supposed to match those 2 circuits. Taken alone, that sounds like a compliment. A team quietly delighted to have exceeded its own pessimistic forecast. But rewind just one day earlier, to Saturday afternoon, and the tone in the car was noticeably different. Lewis Hamilton, moments after qualifying 6th, radioed back a blunt, almost clipped assessment, lost a lot of time on the straights. That message didn't sound like a driver bracing for a modest result and then being pleasantly surprised. It sounded like a driver flagging a real, specific weakness in real time, the kind of comment that usually precedes a difficult race rather than a strong one. So which version is the accurate one? A team whose own driver was raising an alarm on Saturday, or a team whose principal was praising the outcome on Sunday? It's entirely possible both are true, and that the gap between those 2 moods is exactly where this story lives. To understand why any of this matters, it helps to translate the technical side into plain terms, because the phrase straight-line telemetry doesn't mean much on its own. Formula One's 2026 power units lean heavily on electrical energy deployment, batteries that feed extra power down long straights, then recharge under braking and through corners, so there's enough stored energy for the next full-throttle zone. When a car clips, it means the internal combustion side of the engine gets throttled back, usually because the battery has run low before the straight actually ends, and the car loses top-end power at precisely the moment it needs it most. Spa's back straight, the long run from turn 13 down toward Les Combes, is one of the most demanding tests of this system anywhere on the calendar, because it's long enough that a car with even a slightly worse energy strategy will visibly lose ground before the braking zone arrives. Practice session data from the Spa weekend showed Hamilton losing roughly 12 km per hour on corner entry compared to the fastest reference times on track, and closer to 20 km per hour under braking into the campus chicane specifically. Those aren't abstract numbers. In a sport where qualifying gaps are frequently measured in hundredths of a second, losses of that size at individual corners can be the difference between the front of the grid and the middle of it. And once a deficit like that becomes public knowledge, it stops being a private engineering concern and starts becoming a psychological one too. Because every driver on the grid now knows exactly where to attack a Ferrari on a given lap. Now to the evidence itself, and it's worth being careful here about separating what's actually confirmed from what's reasonable but unproven inference. It's verified that Ferrari's practice telemetry at Spa showed measurable losses for Hamilton at specific, identifiable points on the lap. It's verified that pre-weekend reporting described Spa as a circuit expected to be especially difficult for the SF26, precisely because of its straight-line efficiency demands and its complex battery recovery requirements. It's also verified that, heading into qualifying, the Ferrari-powered runners were described as more scattered through the order compared with the tightly grouped Mercedes cars, a pattern some read as further proof of an underlying power unit disadvantage. But here's where the story gets genuinely uncertain, rather than just dramatic. It wasn't publicly confirmed which specification of Ferrari's power unit Hamilton and Leclerc were actually running that weekend. There has been talk of a modified specification, sometimes referred to in reporting as having gone through an internal update process, versus an earlier version that may have simply been part of a normal rotation between engines across the season. Some believe that distinction could meaningfully change how a given car manages energy deployment over a single lap. Others caution, and this is a fair point, that without official word from Ferrari on exactly which units were fitted, any conclusion drawn from that weekend's telemetry about the Ferrari power unit might really be a conclusion about one specific version of it, possibly not even the most current one. If that's the case, the entire straight-line narrative risks measuring an old problem and mistaking it for a current one, and everyone building theories around it is essentially working from an incomplete map. The counter-narrative here deserves just as much weight, because it isn't coming from skeptical outsiders. It's coming from within Ferrari itself. Vasseur specifically attributed part of the team's Spa deficit to traction, rather than to the engine alone, which reframes the entire conversation. If traction is the real culprit, then the story isn't fundamentally about batteries and energy deployment at all. It's about mechanical grip, about how cleanly the car puts power down, coming out of Spa's slower, tighter sections, before it ever reaches the long straight where everyone's been looking for answers. And here's the uncomfortable part. A car that struggles with traction, out of a slow corner, will show up on a speed trace looking almost identical to a car with a genuine battery or power unit problem, because both produce the same visible symptom, a car that's simply slower on the straight that follows. Some in the paddock lean toward the power unit explanation, largely because it fits a pattern that's shown up at other high-speed circuits already this season. Others lean toward Vasseur's traction explanation, on the reasoning that it's coming directly from the person with the fullest view of the car's actual development priorities. Neither explanation has been ruled out. Ferrari itself, as far as public reporting shows, hasn't definitively settled which factor is doing more damage, and until it does, anyone claiming certainty in either direction is filling a gap Ferrari itself hasn't closed. Widen the lens further, and a season-long pattern does start to emerge, though how much weight that pattern deserves is itself part of the disagreement. Ferrari's straight-line deficit has been a recurring subplot for much of 2026, well before Spa ever came into view. Earlier season reporting, built on independent speed trace analysis, suggested Ferrari-powered cars were consistently losing several miles per hour more than Mercedes-powered cars by the end of long straights, with the effect described as most severe, specifically at tracks featuring extended full-throttle sections and limited braking zones. That's precisely the category of circuit Spa belongs to, and it's the same category of circuit where Vasseur admitted, in his own words, that the team wasn't expecting things to go as well as they did. If the underlying issue really is a persistent, season-long characteristic of the power unit, then Spa isn't a standalone story at all. It's simply the newest entry in a file that's been quietly accumulating since the earliest rounds of the year. Race after race, circuit after circuit, each one adding another data point to a picture that some believe has already been drawn. But if Vasseur's traction explanation genuinely carries more weight than the energy deployment theory, then folding Spa into that older narrative risks force-fitting a fresh result into a familiar shape, just because the surface pattern looks the same as before. It's worth asking here whether the sport's own appetite for a tidy season-long storyline is doing some of the work that the actual data hasn't finished doing yet. The stakes attached to all of this extend well past a single Sunday's finishing order. Antonelli now leads the Drivers' Championship by 45 points over Hamilton following Spa, a gap that widened in part because George Russell retired after a first-lap collision with Hamilton, an incident that earned Hamilton a 5-second penalty and, in a separate but connected sequence, contributed to the chaotic double-stacked pit stop that led to Ferrari's unsafe release fine. For a team that had won 2 of the previous 3 races heading into Belgium, through Hamilton at Barcelona and Leclerc at Silverstone, a lingering straight-line weakness isn't just a technical footnote buried in a data file. It's a genuine question about whether Ferrari can sustain a title challenge across every remaining circuit type, or whether those recent wins depended on layouts that happened to disguise the underlying problem rather than solve it. Some believe the podium finishes are proof that Ferrari has genuinely closed the gap through steady chassis development, exactly in line with Vasseur's own description of incremental upgrades paying off step by step. Others believe the power unit's underlying character hasn't actually changed at all, and that Ferrari has simply been the beneficiary of favorable circumstances. Safety car timing, well-executed strategy calls, misfortune for its rivals, that happen to convert a fundamentally compromised car into results that look stronger than they really are. Both readings point to the exact same finishing order and arrive at completely opposite conclusions about what it means for the rest of the season. And with a 45-point gap already open at the championship's midpoint, the cost of guessing wrong about which explanation is correct isn't academic. It's a title fight that could be decided by whichever theory turns out to be true. And here's where the story genuinely complicates itself rather than resolving. If Ferrari's SF26 really is losing meaningful ground on every long straight because of energy deployment limits, how did Leclerc end up finishing within 2 seconds of a Mercedes that supposedly holds a clear straight-line advantage at exactly the kind of circuit where that advantage should matter most? The VSC-assisted pit stop explains part of it, since it gifted Leclerc track position he might not have earned on pure pace alone. But Leclerc didn't just inherit second place and quietly fade backward. Post-race analysis credited him with keeping Antonelli honest right through the closing laps, which suggests that whatever straight-line deficit existed on Saturday wasn't large enough, once race conditions and tire wear evened things out on Sunday, to fully separate the 2 cars. That's a genuinely awkward detail for anyone trying to build a clean, simple story about a team blindsided by its own weakness. A car that's meaningfully compromised on the straights shouldn't, in theory, be able to keep a dominant pole-sitter honest lap after lap in race trim. So either the qualifying session telemetry overstates the real deficit once fuel loads and tire degradation are factored in, or Ferrari's energy management strategy does something in race conditions that closes the gap when it counts most. And nobody in the public reporting has fully explained which of those 2 things is actually happening. Is the real story here about Saturday's data, or about whatever Ferrari changed between Saturday and Sunday that nobody outside the garage has been told about? There's also a quieter, more human layer to all of this that rarely makes it into the data conversations. 2 Ferrari drivers, both operating under intense scrutiny, both aware that every radio message and every post-session comment gets dissected within minutes, are navigating a season where the car's true character seems to shift, depending on which circuit it's bolted to. Some believe that inconsistency itself is starting to weigh on strategic decision-making inside the garage, making it harder for Ferrari to commit fully to one developmental direction when the evidence keeps pointing in slightly different directions from race to race. Others argue that this kind of circuit-dependent variance is completely normal for any team still refining a new set of regulations, and that reading psychological strain into what is really just an engineering learning curve says more about the appetite for drama than about what's actually happening on the pit wall. Either way, the drivers keep racing, the upgrades keep arriving in small increments, and the public keeps trying to reverse engineer certainty out of a picture that even the team itself hasn't fully assembled. So where does that leave the central claim? That Ferrari's telemetry from Spa left the team genuinely stunned. It leaves it exactly where a careful reading of the evidence should leave it, unresolved, and probably unresolvable from the outside for now. There's real, documented data showing measurable straight-line losses at specific corners. There's a blunt, unscripted radio message from Hamilton that reads like authentic surprise in the moment it was said. There's also a team principal publicly calling the overall weekend better than expected, and a race performance that arguably contradicts how severe the qualifying session numbers made things look. Was Ferrari stunned by discovering an entirely new problem, or stunned by how much they managed to overcome an old and familiar one? Was this really an engine story at all, or was it a traction story, exactly as Vasseur hinted, and few people outside the team fully absorbed? And if nobody beyond Ferrari's own garage knows for certain which power unit specification was even fitted to those cars that weekend, how much of this entire conversation is standing on solid ground versus reasonable-sounding guesswork dressed up as hard analysis? None of that gets settled here, and it likely won't get settled before the next long straight forces the same question back onto the table. Hungary's characteristics don't expose this particular weakness the way Spa's did, so the real test waits for whichever upcoming circuit offers a straight long enough to make the batteries argue with themselves all over again. Until then, the telemetry stays open to interpretation, Vasseur's comments stay open to interpretation, and the one thing that isn't really in dispute is that Ferrari, whatever actually happened inside that data, is heading into the second half of the season carrying a question about itself that it hasn't fully answered in public, and may not be in any hurry to.